Hi folks. I don't consider myself a Marxist, and I have some strong critiques of postmodernism, but I think Jordan Peterson gets a lot of things terribly wrong about both Marx and postmodernism. When he starts railing against neo-Marxist postmodernists, I think he gets carried away by a dangerous reactionary current. The tone of his voice changes very drastically whenever he brings up the kind of often admittedly ridiculous campus activism he has encountered. He goes from sounding very thoughtful and reasonable to rather polemical and angry. I discussed this reactionary vibe in my last video. I don't find polemics helpful whether they come from left-wing proponents of identity politics or reactionary right-wingers. I'm not an expert on Marx or postmodernism. Luckily, it does not take anything close to an expert on either to show that Peterson has serious misconceptions about both. So, a stay-at-home dad, former librarian, with a YouTube channel like myself should suffice, as it does not take a ton of research to disprove many of his claims. First, let me start with what Peterson gets right about postmodernism. He rightly states that postmodernism grew out of a group of French intellectuals who came very late to the realization or acknowledgement of what a horror Stalinist Russia and Maoist China had become. This seems a very standard view of the origins of postmodernism, and is one shared even by leftists like anarchist Noam Chomsky and Marxist Terry Eagleton. To the extent that postmodernists claim a political position, they replaced Marxist talk of class with other groups they saw as marginalized. However, I don't think you can categorize the postmodern proponents of identity politics Peterson butts up against as Marxist or neo-Marxist. I know quite a few Marxists who would strongly object to this categorization. The strain of identity politics that seems so popular right now doesn't even bother to pay lip service to issues of class most of the time. A Marxist that does not talk about class seems like a priest that does not talk about God. I think most Marxists would suggest that the focus on identity politics is not some sinister attempt to sneak Marxist ideology into society. It is an abandonment of Marxism in favor of something else. Rather than seeking to change who owns the means of production or working for other changes Marxists care about, identity politics surrenders any meaningful attempt to change the power structures of society. It sees the project of traditional Marxists as defeated. Instead, it seeks to make superficial changes to the culture. If you would like a more detailed view of this, please read Terry Eagleton's The Illusions of Postmodernism. In this work, the unapologetic Marxist Eagleton points out the contradictions and fallacies of postmodernism by showing fans of this mode of thought that they never believed what they thought they believed in the first place. For what it's worth, Eagleton shares an affinity for religion and Christianity with Peterson, and is as critical of the new atheist movement as anyone. He has had a public conversation with conservative Roger Scruton, and I would personally love to see an exchange between Eagleton and Peterson. Given that he claims not to use email or the internet, it might be difficult to coordinate this. I also suggest checking out a video I'll link to in the description that goes into great detail on all the things Peterson gets wrong about postmodernism. For instance, Peterson makes the often repeated claim that Derrida thought any reading of a text was as good as any other, a charge of relativism. It should seem absurd on the face of it to suggest that anyone actually believes in relativism. Ask yourself if you know anyone who thinks any idea is as good as any other. Even if they say it, they don't do it in practice. Peterson also seems ignorant or unconcerned with the fact that Derrida was essentially a literary theorist, and attributing any kind of political doctrine to him does not make a whole lot of sense. From the Derrida I have read, he just comes off as a trickster, or a poet that writes using the language and ideas of the Western philosophical tradition. Though I think postmodern style has some value, I also find the jargon-laden, purposely incomprehensible text worth criticizing. But I don't think Peterson has taken the time to actually engage with postmodern thinkers directly, and has instead relied on Stephen Hicks's work, which seriously misrepresents it. If he did, he would understand how many postmodern qualities his own work has. On to Marx. I find that Peterson misrepresents Marx in a way that really puts me off because he rehashes all the standard Cold War right-wing knee-jerk reactions to his name, and I don't find this useful. Peterson has stated that he does think inequality is a problem for society, and while I don't call myself a Marxist, I don't find his reaction to Marx helpful if we want to discuss alternatives or modifications to capitalism that could provide the equality of opportunity Peterson claims he desires to see. If we want to achieve this, we must parse out what different systems get wrong and right. We can't do that if we start frothing at the mouth and pounding straw man at the mention of Marx's name. Peterson's criticisms of Marxism come straight out of the John Birch Society talking points, which along with his paranoid belief that postmodernism will destroy the fabric of society, puts him in the company of this guy.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
Have you ever heard of a thing called fluoridation? Fluoridation of water? Do you realize that fluoridation is the most monstrously conceived and dangerous communist plot we have ever had to face?
In any case, I find myself in a strange position. I have very mixed opinions about Marx. I don't consider myself a Marxist, but some of his ideas have influenced me directly and indirectly, and I certainly think he is worth reading. I think even ardent capitalists will find Marx had important things to say about our economic system. Some of his observations are as relevant as ever, while others apply much more to his own time than ours. But any mode of thought that requires you to learn a bunch of jargon in order to understand it sets off a red flag for me. This is often, though not always, the sign of a closed system, one constructed in such a way to keep competing ideas out. Peterson would call this an ideology, and it is something I would represent with the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail. Yet, Marx certainly discusses some concepts worth understanding: alienated labor, surplus value, the means of production, and so on. But I hear Peterson saying things that are so obviously wrong that I feel compelled to call him on it. The kind of facts about Marx that I learned in high school. Mind you, I did not go to some progressive high school. I went to a rather traditional all-boys Catholic high school. To be honest, I read the Communist Manifesto a long time ago and have not gotten around to reading Capital myself. I might read it if I have the time to give it the attention it deserves. I have not tackled it because I must admit, Marxist jargon makes me a bit sleepy, and with 2 children taking up most of my time, I don't see that changing anytime soon. Still, I have read or talked with enough people familiar with Marx to see that Peterson presents a caricature or straw man of Marxism to criticize. These criticisms are not new. Some of them involve obstacles to change Marx foresaw himself. Terry Eagleton, who I mentioned earlier, deals with all these arguments in Why Marx Was Right. There are some valid criticisms of Eagleton's defense, but for the most part it holds up. Peterson's criticisms of Marxism stand out not only because he makes very common and easily shot down arguments, but because he can discuss his own field with a fair degree of nuance. When he criticizes Marxism and postmodernism, he often gets visibly agitated. This seems like a tell to me that he is engaging with these ideas on a more emotional level. I admire the way he dealt with a hostile interviewer on Channel 4, but we see none of this coolness when he talks about the ideology he sees as the enemy. I would like to give the kind of rebuttal a Marxist might offer, even though, as Karl Marx once said, I am not a Marxist. I find the best way to begin is by using Peterson's own arguments against it. First, he mockingly throws out the old favorite, that was not real Marxism, implying that those who find the ends or means pursued by Lenin, Stalin, and Mao inconsistent with their brand of Marxism are guilty of the no true Scotsman fallacy. Forget for a second that this is not an actual fallacy. Look it up. And that he answers it with a straw man argument, which is an actual fallacy. Instead, I would like to point out that Peterson plays this same game himself. Brazil has a nationalized steel industry that provides cheap steel to other industries in that country. This subsidizes those industries and has helped Brazil become a formidable economic power. Is that not real Marxism? Are the Scandinavian countries that have lots of nationalized industries that do the same thing Marxist? Economists steeped in the works of Marx, like Michael Hudson, predicted the 2008 financial crash when mainstream economists thought the market could keep rising forever. Is that not real Marxism? When a country like the UK or Peterson's native Canada applies social democratic programs like universal health care, is that real Marxism? Are the labor unions that gave people the 8-hour workday, overtime pay, and improved working conditions real Marxism? Are the New Deal and other social democratic programs real Marxism? Or do only the horrors of the Soviet Union and communist China count as real Marxism? I could go on at great length and point out all the places that Marxist ideas get applied, but I think you get the point. Despite what Peterson claims, you can apply Marxist ideas without having to march people off to the gulags. That is what people mean when they reject the Soviet Union and communist China as examples of Marxist ideas. It is not that they think things would have turned out better if they had been involved. It is that there are much more effective and humane ways to go about introducing Marxist and socialist ideas into a country that have actually worked and are more in line with what Marx actually wrote. They not only disagree with the ends that Lenin, Stalin, and Mao achieved, but also the means. Peterson does not differentiate between Marx, Marxism, and Leninism. I would call the kind of violent revolution to overthrow a state and institute a communist government that Peterson objects to Leninism. Few people advocate this. Perhaps some of the young, radical college kids that Peterson has butted heads with do, but most people with positive things to say about Marx don't. Some of what Peterson gets wrong is high school history stuff, or was when I went to school. Perhaps they no longer teach this, and that explains why Peterson can get away with it. Marx thought you needed to have capitalism somewhere before you could have socialism. China and Russia were both feudal when Mao and Lenin came to power. Marx also saw little hope for achieving socialism in a single state because it would have to put so much effort into holding off threats from capitalist states. This seems like a pretty accurate description of how the Cold War played out. Peterson also scolds those who criticize capitalism for comparing it to some ideal system instead of other existing systems. But Peterson takes the same ahistorical approach when he talks about countries like Cuba and Venezuela. He compares them to capitalist countries like the US, but does not compare them to what they looked like before they adopted more Marxist practices. Nor does he compare them to Latin countries still under the thumb of the US. If he did, he would have to note that Batista was much more brutal than Castro ever was, and that the countries that fall in line with US policy have extreme poverty and repression too. While it is more than reasonable to criticize the Castro regime, it is also reasonable to point out that while Cuba certainly lacks material wealth, they provide their citizens with free education and health care despite this poverty, something a much richer country like the US can't get right. Just as it is worth pointing out that plenty of countries have accomplished this without violent revolution or brutal political oppression. Venezuela had extreme poverty before Chavez was democratically elected. The rates of poverty dropped drastically after he came to power. Venezuela is going through difficult times right now because they did not diversify their economy. They relied too heavily on oil, and when the price of oil dropped, their economy went down with it. You can argue that this shortcoming had something to do with the nationalized oil industry and central planning. Fair enough. I'm not a fan of central planning. But non-socialist countries also face problems like this when they rely too heavily on one commodity or mismanage their economies. Capitalists can mismanage the economies of countries just as poorly as socialists. You can argue that the market does not allow for this. This might work in theory, but in practice, these people can buy enough influence that they don't face any repercussions, as we saw in the 2008 crisis. The reason why Venezuela and so many other Latin American countries have such extreme poverty to begin with is because multinational corporations took on the same role that colonial powers played in an earlier time, extracting resources and wealth, exploiting cheap labor, and leaving next to nothing for the people who lived there. For this reason, amongst others, Marxist and socialist ideas became very popular in Latin America and other countries. The US reacted to this by supporting coups that overthrew democratically elected leaders and installed brutal dictators. It would take far too long to discuss all the places across the globe this has happened, but anyone familiar with the history of the 20th century knows this. Marx's work mostly critiques capitalism and has very little to say about the means of building a socialist or communist state. So you can't lay the atrocities of the Soviet Union or communist China at his feet. And if we wanted to apply this standard to all thinkers, where would Adam Smith fall? The imperialist capitalist powers who colonized India, Africa, and the Americas created at least as high a pile of bodies, but we don't talk about this as much, partially because it occurred out of the sight of Europeans. In the 19th century alone, tens of millions of people died of preventable famines caused by soaring grain prices that were a result of free market ideology and speculation. To say nothing of the brutality of these colonial powers or the American foreign policy, which has made the US back any brutal regime so long as it opposed communism and supported capitalism. Should we not read Adam Smith because of this and start fuming at the mention of his name like Peterson does with Marx? Of course not. That would be silly. He has plenty of important things worth reading. The same goes for Peterson's favorite philosopher, Nietzsche. Should we not read him because the Nazis twisted his writing to suit their ends? Again, that would be an incredibly reactionary way to approach who we should read. We should read Marx, Adam Smith, and Nietzsche, and glean what we can from their writings, and at the same time criticize them where we see fit. This knee-jerk condemnation of Marx as inherently evil seems irrational. Douglas Lane at Zero Books has suggested a similar body count argument for John Locke, the father of modern liberalism. I will provide a link in the description. Marx is as part of the liberal Western tradition as a thinker can get. You can certainly criticize him, but you should acknowledge his contributions. I think if Marx could meet Peterson, he would give him the old,
You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong. How you ever got to teach a course in anything is totally amazing.
Boy, if life were only like this.
But honestly, I'm not super hot on Marxism. I'm more of an anarchist, at least in my heart of hearts. This means in principle, I question the legitimacy of different forms of authority and hierarchy, and I seek an economic system that does not reduce people to tools in this machine. Practically speaking, I favor social democracy like we had in this country during its time of greatest prosperity between the New Deal and when Reagan started dismantling it. And I think we could move towards syndicalism by encouraging more collectively owned businesses, but that's a topic for another video. I use this as a seg to talk about some of Peterson's political positions that come out of his work as a psychologist. He discusses hierarchy a fair amount. Now, I agree that human beings have a tendency to arrange ourselves into dominance hierarchies, and that these have deep roots in our evolution. However, I have two problems with the conclusions Peterson draws from this. First, I don't think you can argue that human beings will inevitably organize ourselves into hierarchical structures. Yes, we have a tendency to do so, but we also have a tendency to mitigate against these effects. Most of the hunter-gatherer societies humans spent most of our evolutionary history living in are well known for their egalitarian nature and for customs that prevent anyone from accumulating too much wealth or power. In these societies, the head of a group often had the hardest job and was expected to sacrifice the most. Entire books have been written on the subject of the way life cooperates, at least as much as it competes, from Kropotkin's Mutual Aid to countless works on anthropology. Peterson's claims about hierarchy give little consideration to the economic and social realities that create hierarchies. Basic components of our current system perpetuate this inequality and concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. You can argue that the Pareto principle means that this concentration is inevitable, but it seems like a convenient way of ignoring the very real economic, legal, and social structures we could potentially change to improve conditions for people. Second, Peterson claims that leftists don't believe in the idea of competence and that they think hierarchies are only about power. Forget for a second that we can define competence in a lot of different ways. I think leftists do believe in competence. We just don't think we live in a meritocracy and find the suggestion that we do rather absurd on the face of it. The smartest, most competent, or most hardworking do not necessarily end up in positions of power. Surely sometimes they do, but oftentimes it is the opposite. I agree with Noam Chomsky that the things that make people succeed in our system are more likely, quote, some combination of greed, cynicism, obsequiousness, subordination, lack of curiosity, and independence of mind, self-serving disregard for others, and who knows what else, unquote. Different kinds of hierarchies exist. Some are based on inherited wealth or a person's ability to exploit others. Other hierarchies are based on competence. The best athletes rise to the top of hierarchies of competence. We see the same thing in many professions, but the people who accumulate the most money or power don't necessarily provide the most value to society. Many of them just know how to work the system. While this might be a form of competence, it is not one we should accept. Bernie Madoff was very competent at making money scamming people with a Ponzi scheme. And though Peterson might call this an instance of someone cheating and says he does not condone it, much of our economic system functions in a similar way. Nearly all of the big banks' profits come from taxpayer subsidies and bailouts. See the link below, please. That seems like a system with inequality baked right into it, in a way that does not reward people with the most to contribute to society, nor even the people who manage money the most competently. Let me put it this way. If you get to borrow money from the government at next to no interest, and then can't make a profit lending it at much higher interest rates, I consider you either grossly incompetent or corrupt. If, like some of the banks, you can't even turn a profit despite huge subsidies, well, I honestly can't articulate how absurd and broken I find that system. Furthermore, the capitalist system means that people can make money just by owning things and investing, while others need to sell their labor, often by doing jobs that don't compensate them fairly. A system that allows people to make money by collecting rent and speculating in the financial system, while people who actually produce goods and services with their labor get very little of the wealth of that society, has some serious problems that we can't push aside as easily as Peterson wishes by erroneously suggesting that the system we have awards people based on competence. This is the basic criticism Marx and others make of capitalism, and Peterson should take it more seriously. But beyond this, I have a problem with the basic supposition underlying Peterson's stance on hierarchies. Not everyone wants to rise to the top of a hierarchy, not because they are lazy or incompetent, but because they would like to engage in more cooperative behavior, but lament the fact that our system too often pits us against one another, and because they don't find the CEO lifestyle, or even the rewards that come with it, desirable. Some people go in a certain field because they want to give something back to the society that has benefited them, but then find that many of these jobs can't support even the most modest of lifestyles. At times, Peterson seems to suggest that those who criticize the current system are just bitter because they could not do well in it. Leave aside the fact that many who do well in the system do criticize it. This idea that those who complain are just losers does not sit well with me. It seems callous. I'm all for the kind of personal responsibility that Peterson preaches, but once you manage to stand up straight, you have a duty to help the person on the floor next to you get on their feet, not to keep climbing up until you've stepped over everyone else. I also don't think we should all look to emulate the kind of life lived by high-powered executives, and to some extent I think Peterson questions the sanity of people who work these crazy hours in pursuit of money and social status. Peterson seems to think that those who criticize the current system just want what the successful have. But most people don't want all those fabulous games and prizes. They just don't want to have to struggle to get basic needs met. They don't want to go bankrupt paying for healthcare. If they work full-time, they want to bring home a wage that will put a roof over their head and feed their families. They want an education they don't need to go deep into debt to get. They don't want to work so much they never get to enjoy their life. They want a level playing field so they can play the game. Maybe they win, maybe they don't. But they want equality of opportunity, and we don't have that. Peterson often advocates against equality of outcome, as if anyone actually wants this. To suggest that anyone wants equality of outcome seems incredibly disingenuous. Nobody wants this. Possibly some of the more out-of-control campus activists do, but nobody who has seriously considered these things does, and it makes Peterson look a bit ridiculous to suggest that anyone wants to see the same outcomes for everyone. That Peterson argues so much against this shows that he has really gotten carried away, reacting to what seems like a fringe view held only by certain campus activists and in certain corners of social media. Ultimately, my problem with Peterson comes from his extreme conservatism. I don't mean this as a slur or to suggest he aligns himself with a particular party. I know he identifies as a classical liberal. I mean his view of the world is inherently one that looks to avoid change. A part of me appreciates this. It makes sense to conserve the advances we have made, and to some degree, many people don't appreciate the foundation of the culture that we stand on, and that explains his popularity amongst some young people who have never heard this. But to a certain degree, he seems trapped by his own models. He seems to have a hard time imagining anything that does not conform to them. He has an obsession with eliminating chaos, which he associates with the feminine, but chaos always reasserts itself. His resistance to change does not recognize that the tradition he speaks so admiringly of did not spring from the skull of Zeus fully formed. No matter how much he might state he understands this, he does not react to change as if he does. Most of the modern improvements we have today came from people demanding change. I'm sure on some level he understands that, but I wish he would recognize that before reacting to current changes taking shape in our society. In my last video, I talked a little bit about the tarot. In the book I recommended, the author warned not to meditate directly on the devil card of the tarot. What you contemplate, you imitate, and you don't want to imitate the devil. The author comes at this from the place of a Catholic hermeticist. But another book on the tarot I enjoy, written by an artist of many mediums, has a different view. In Way of the Tarot, Alejandro Jodorowsky points out that this arcana represents the creative impulse, things in the system that are new, that have not found their place in it yet at first glance might look like abominations. But without these new things coming into the system, it never changes, it never evolves, it never adapts, and it dies. That this card is represented by a hermaphrodite seems very appropriate in the discussion about Jordan Peterson having difficulty adjusting to change. Having heard Peterson talk about retrieving the dead father, I think he understands this to some extent, but I think he needs to do a better job grappling with these ideas. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you would like to help me make more videos, please contribute to my Patreon. I have a link in the description. I'm Greg Belvedere. Remember, all generalizations are stupid, so never speak in absolutes. Thank you.
It's incredibly obvious, isn't it? A foreign substance is introduced into our precious bodily fluids without the knowledge of the individual, certainly without any choice. That's the way a hardcore commie works.